Hi, everyone. Thanks for coming out tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Vivian Ziherl and then slightly afterwards, Elizabeth Pavanelli. I think we will begin with Vivian doing a presentation, and then a conversation between the two. By way of introduction, Vivian Ziherl is a critic and curator from Australia, currently living and working in Amsterdam. In 2015, she founded the art and research project Frontier Imaginaries. Prior to that, she worked with If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be Part of Your Revolution, led the curatorial platform Landings together with Natasha Ginwala, staged performance programs at the Stedelijk Museum together with Hendrik Volkerts, and edited several books, including Lip Anthology. And Elizabeth A. Pavanelli teaches anthropology and gender studies at Columbia University. She was previously editor of Public Culture, and her most recent books are Geontologies, A Requiem to Late Liberalism, The Empire of Love, and Economies of Abandonment. Her writing and filmography focus on the conditions of otherwise in late liberalism. She is a founding member of the Caribbean Film Collective. And I should also note, it's a really kind of fortuitous union, and it made me remember how I first met Vivian, or kind of virtually met Vivian, by stalking her on Facebook. But why? Why did I stalk her on Facebook? It was a totally bizarre, incredibly kind of, in this kind of, like the planets aligned. It was where she dropped a quote from Beth as a response to a post, and I would like to kind of bring this story into the room tonight. But okay, it was August 23rd, 2012. Heeman Chong, who was a mutual friend, who's an artist in Singapore, he wrote, "Most lists make me happy, but this list depresses me." The list was a list of maybe 15 or 20 biennials: the Shanghai Biennial, the Taipei Biennial, the Whitstable Biennial, Documenta, Guangzhou Biennial, Liverpool Biennial, Mediations Biennial, Sydney Biennial, Kochi Mazuris Biennial, Los Angeles Biennial, Mongolia 360-degree Land Art Biennial, Beaufort Triennial, Western China Biennial, Shenzhen Sculpture Biennial, Tbilisi Biennial, Asian Art Biennial, Busan Biennial, Ichigo Tsumari Art Triennial, Sao Paulo Biennial, Asia Pacific Triennial, Baltic Triennial, Seoul Media Art Biennial, La Triennale, right? So in response to this entire list, Vivian wrote, or rather she copy-pasted, "The surround is without an opening. It is an infinity of homogeneous space and time. It is an everywhere at the same time, and a nowhere else." This was taken from a recently published text, After the Last Man, Images and Ethics of Becoming Otherwise, in issue 35 of e-flux Journal from May 2012, Beth's text, where, in relation to Kojève and Fukuyama, she wrote, "If liberal democracy is the horizon of desire, already inscribed in the fight for recognition, the orientation and end of human becoming, and thus the end of history itself, then, when liberal democracy has been universally achieved, human historical becoming collapses into a satisfied human state of being. The horizon then becomes what I will call a surround, a form of enclosure without a wall or gate." And then, the copy-paste quote, "The surround is without an opening. It is an infinity of homogeneous space and time. It is an everywhere at the same time and a nowhere else. One can go here or there in the surround, but it really makes no difference because there are no meaningful distinctions left to orient oneself, to determine where one goes or what one believes or holds true. To paraphrase Nietzsche, there is no shepherd or herd in the surround." Maybe there is one now. "Everyone wants the same." "Everyone wants the same because they are the same. Even the hope of the madhouse, as the place where difference is interned, is lost because difference no longer exists." Let's give a warm welcome to Vivian Ziherl.
Yeah, and it's amazing that Brian's brought that up, because my whole kind of foregrounding spiel was exactly about what a moment that was and what a moment it is now. Because then in 2012, I was kind of fresh out of Apple Art School, and I'd kind of come from Brisbane, which was this place that painfully experiences itself as being on the edge of European space in this very settler-minded, painful way. And I'd kind of crash landed into Amsterdam in this program that sort of promised to sort of give one a magic carpet ride into the art world. And I came across Beth's two texts, one first published in 2011 in e-flux journal number 27, Roots Worlds, and then the next one published in 2012 in e-flux journal 35, After the Last Man. And they were enormously helpful to me in explaining and understanding this weird world that I was entering into from this funny, dusty, slow place of Brisbane. So to a certain extent tonight, what we sort of have is a kind of a return that's really quite sweet, because Beth's work and yeah, so, you know, like maybe those two essays were kind of like the gateway drug to what is now a very fully fledged Povinelli theory addiction, you know, where I kind of like can't think without bad. But so, I mean, to an extent what we've got is that like that theory sort of helped me figure things out for about 5 years, organizing art shows. And there's a text that I wrote in the latest issue of the e-flux journal, which is now in the 80s, 87 or something? 81, okay. That was kind of saying like, okay, and this is what I think I've learned. But yeah, so saying I should also acknowledge there's many people who have also been guiding that work, and someone who's really important is Denise Ferreira da Silva, who really edited that text and kind of did some surgical rescues to it at certain points, and she's really important to mention. So before going into the theory stuff, I thought I'd just explain a couple of things about frontier imaginaries, because that is the kind of organism through which all of these ideas arise and need to be negotiated, and so it's kind of the formative space of it all. So Frontier Imaginaries, and this is the website, is basically an art and research project, and it started in Brisbane in 2015, but 2016 was kind of the first manifestation. And it was really just a big art show that happened across 3 art spaces in Brisbane: the Institute of Modern Art, who made the first invitation, the QUT Art Museum, and the Australian Cinematheque. So there was about 24 artists, and it approached Brisbane through this concept, which was a kind of a rhetorical tool that provoked a certain friction in Brisbane of the idea of the frontier. And I'll talk about that a bit more in a second. So the second edition was able to happen because of an amazing invitation by the Al Ma'amul Foundation, which is a Palestinian art foundation in Jerusalem, who then invited the project to continue in Palestine and in dialogue with Palestinian artists and social projects. And that edition had about 35 artists and cultural heritage collections and scholars and poets and social movements, etc. And there's a certain way in which the first edition in Brisbane took this traction of what that is as a place and then moved it to Jerusalem, kind of dragged it across, and then continued to gather up and bring more people into the dialogue, but still to try to maintain a kind of a critical friction with what the location was. So this has just gone up today, which has been a big web design achievement and long process, but it's the beginning of the third edition, and that occurs upon the occasion in which Frontier Imaginaries is now developing corporate personhood. Because of the way that it's growing, it's necessary for me to actually incorporate it, to become a stichting in the Netherlands, and therefore the term for this edition is asset. And actually it's 3 conversations across 3 different places. The first one will be the Van Abbe Museum, Eindhoven, where it's asset in brackets acquire. And the reason for that is that the Van Abbe Museum invited me to organize one day of a big caucus, a conference program that they're doing. And I said, well, sure, we could have a conversation, but with Frontier Imaginaries, we normally the ideas kind of come through encountering stuff and doing stuff. And so I'm fortunate to have some very good working relationships with a number of groups from within the Afro-Caribbean community in the Netherlands. And so I brought a couple of these people across who lead organizations who all happen to be women. So the director of the Belmer Park Theatre, Ernestine Convalius, the director of the Hip Hop House, Aruna Vermeulen, and one of the chief organizers in the University of Color, which is an amazing student organization that came out of the occupations of the University of Amsterdam, which in fact far exceeded in dates, in duration, and in impact the occupations that happened in '68 as well. So these folks I got to come across to meet with the Van Abba, and I said, well, Van Abba, I said to my friends, this is the Van Abba, and this is why I think they're excellent, and you should offer them a certain amount of trust, even though they're a big institution. And Van Abba, this is my colleagues, and this is why I think they're brilliant. And what I think we should do is that I think you, the Van Abba, should offer one of your acquisition budgets to these guys as an acquisition and research team. And we should talk about what they want to buy and why they want to buy it and what that means. And that process is the conversation. So that's kind of ongoing at the moment. And this is one thing that we're discussing, which is the Cabra mask. The second edition, which is asset transition, takes place with relation to an island that's off the coast of Brisbane. That island, the economy has been a mining economy for about the last 60 years. And is there something wrong? No, okay, sorry. It's in the process of, so the environmental movement has won, which is great. The mines are being closed down, but there's now a transition plan on the part of the government that the economy of the island should become self-sustaining through world-class eco-tourism and cultural heritage within a sort of a very short amount of period and with little kind of sense of what that actually means on the ground. So we're talking about transition there. And then the third one, which is sort of presaging also what the conversation tonight might move toward, will take place here sort of as a collaboration with Columbia University, Beth kind of making the invitation, and also with e-flux as well. And we'll be discussing an idea that Beth has been exploring of toxic sovereignty. And a number of wonderful colleagues at Columbia University who are a research group, who are a collective authoring entity that's not, you know, the love objective tonight, Beth Pavanelli. October. Oh, no, that's bad, because, yes, exactly. Yeah, no, there's a bunch of things, and anyway. A bit under construction. But, so that's the context, yes, October 20th to 22nd. So that's kind of the context for the material that I'm going to discuss and present tonight. And I need to just switch to the PowerPoint. I'm really sorry, but I don't think I know how to, oh, here we are, awesome. And here, cool. So Beth is with us, and Brian is here, which is amazing, because at the moment he saw this thing on Facebook. You know, it was a person I'd never met. So it's amazing, and it's, in all those years, this is actually the first time that I've come to the physical space of e-flux as well. Yesterday was the very first time. You know, when I walked into the offices, and being here at e-flux, I keep having these encounters where there's like a person who comes and he's talking in the conversations, and Brian's like, this is Stephen, or this is Kay, and I'm like, Jesus, like an email address just became a person in front of me, you know? And of course, it's an editing relationship, so often it's a very tight, intensive deadline, you have this quick back and forth, and then suddenly these are becoming like fleshy, sweaty people in front of me, which is kind of curious. Sweet-smelling ones, sweet-smelling. But so, you know, with that in mind, there's an artist that Frontier Imaginaries has worked with from the start, who's called Demian Dene Yazi, and he's from the States. He's the only artist that Frontier Imaginaries has worked with from the States, and when I knew we were coming here, I really wanted him to be here, and we tried to find a way, but it just wasn't possible. And so I asked if he might offer an image to start us off anyway, as a sort of a token of some sort. And so he sent this through, which was an image that was in a slide exhibition that he did in protest of some kind of a Portland Biennale that had basically 1 or maybe 0 Indigenous artists, and he was kind of responding to that. And Demian's work is one of many practices within frontier imaginaries that the project is in a kind of a learning dialogue with, that continues to evolve and that's really crucial to what it is that frontier imaginaries does. So I wanted to start also by explaining a bit about what I mean by the frontier and why it is that I arrived to that as a word that really animates the work that I do and that, you know, even sort of founds a project. So the frontier is a term that I started using in part to explain where I was coming from and in part to try to articulate what I was doing to colleagues in the Netherlands. So first of all, the frontier is a kind of a confrontation to Brisbane, where I'm from, and especially given that the first edition was in Brisbane, it has a lot of friction in that space. So Brisbane is a city of about 2 million people, a lot of high-rise skyscrapers, wonderful sort of quote-unquote lifestyle, a lot of people from Melbourne and Sydney who want to have a good family life move up there. And it likes to consider itself as a quote-unquote global city, and it invests a lot of money and effort in branding itself that way. It went to all the lengths of hosting a G8 summit, and during that period of time, there were banners everywhere across town saying like Brisbane Global City in case you missed the message. You know, it was like there the whole time. And so my argument is that Brisbane is a frontier town, and that is a condition that governs every part of how that town functions and about how people deal with each other in it. And so what I mean by that, I think I often illustrate with this image. So the small map of Australia in the corner is in fact a United States military map from 1945, because when General MacArthur was forced out of the Philippines by the Japanese, he moved the headquarters of his operations to Brisbane. And so the entire Pacific theater of World War II was in fact operated from Brisbane. And at that time, there leaked into the public realm this idea of the Brisbane line, which was extremely controversial. And that idea was that there was a small line across the top of Brisbane that went from the coast to the Dividing Ranges Mountains, and that in the event of a Japanese invasion, everything north of that would not be defended. Well, so that's obviously the vast majority, in fact, of the country. And so it begins to, you know, often countries, nations are sort of given as some kind of a border outline on a map. But what this offers is what is differentiated or heterogeneous within that space. And you can sort of see how what is actually settled is really the bottom right corner. And what is north of that is kind of governed by a very dramatic urban-rural relation, a relation that's like settled, not quite really ever properly settled. So on the other hand, being someone who's lived and worked in Amsterdam for about the last 6 years, the term frontier is a term that's useful to me in explaining the perspective of my work and of the artists that I work with to colleagues in the Netherlands. So there I often find that the institutions of rule of law and the compacts of the nation state are so naturalized that it can be hard to try to convey what it is to be existing in a condition where those structures are stretched quite thin. And actually, often a lot of my work in the Netherlands is based around trying to say to my colleagues there, like, no, I don't mean border, I mean frontier. I don't mean a line, which is the contractual agreement between two legal entities that can recognize each other. I mean the very edge of that as a functional contractual space, you know. And often we think of frontier as a territorial thing, but I think it's very much organized around whether a contractual agreement can be made or not. You know, whether there is even a terms of actually producing some kind of agreement that functions. Yeah, and so to kind of illustrate that, this is a badly photographed little map, but these are the forts that were built in 1605 to 1608 at the beginning of the 12 Years' Truce. So that was after the Second Great Revolution in the Netherlands, pushing out the Spanish, trying to begin to form this like republic. And so all of the triangles within the image are the big forts that were built during the 12 Years' Truce period that was kind of enabled because Charles V had to attend to affairs in France. And so they kind of had a moment to bunker down and prepare this. This continues. I mean, I did a lot of research and work, and I put myself in Eindhoven over the period of the election, which is North Brabant, which actually kind of falls outside of the bottom right end of this. And in fact, a lot of the territory that falls outside of the bottom right end of this, but within the Dutch national border, is the far-right PVV, Geert Wilders voting area as well. So again, within the Netherlands, this kind of heterogeneous space that's still governed by other forces than a border. So Frontier Imaginaries, in that way, is an art project that works from the point of view of artists who, I argue, are working at or on the frontier. And it's working in relation to a set of crises that are occurring within the structure of the market nation state. And I argue that these liberal democratic crises of the market nation state have a particular set of consequences for artistic work. And there's a series of media grabs that I like to play to try to dramatize what this is, that I think a lot of us are kind of encountering. So the first is this little manifesto from the neo-reactionaries, and there was in fact an essay in the last edition of e-flux kind of unpacking their particular critique of liberalism. And it's always uncanny to read these things because it's like, they hate liberalism, I hate liberalism, we agree on a lot of stuff, but we have really different projects, you know? So when you read down it, it's sort of, there's all these points where we kind of agree, like political parties destabilize European countries. No, that's not one that I agree with. There's some that are really, elites use government departments fight proxy wars against each other that ruin foreign countries. I totally agree. Women are married to the state, children are owned by the state, that's Foucault. Do you know what I mean? There's all these things, but then it's very interesting to me that they get to the very bottom of their list, and their kind of final punch in the argument is that politics has destroyed aesthetics and made it ugly. And so it's kind of fascinating to me that there's somehow a dispute around the aesthetics that is unsettled within this crisis of liberal democracy. And it's interesting also that this list echoes really, really strongly the PVV party platform. So I'm not sure if you guys are really down with sort of Dutch political stuff, but there was this party called the Party for Freedom, who were led by this very radical kind of new populist right figure called Geert Wilders, who's one of the people who's really kind of developed and popularized anti-Islamic discourse. He's been invited to Australia a number of times by our far-right guys to teach them how to be anti-Islamic. And their party platform basically went, close all the mosques, deport all the refugees, deport everyone on a 2-passport, end all refugee services. And then the next point was end arts funding. Really similar kind of program. So the next little media grab that I play is from, whoops, that's not the right one. Oh, okay, I can find it very quickly. Is from Cuttebing Film Collective, which Beth is a founding member of, and in particular from a little intro that they made on the occasion of being nominated to the Visible Art Award by me. So this is a few minutes on Cuttebing and the conditions that they're working with.
Mr. YA now must have bloody disconnect here. We decided to make a association. I mean, tides out, but I mean, coming
together.
When it comes in, coming together.
What am I looking for?
We just drop it around.
All right, fine.
So we come in and say hello.
Yeah.
But we're staying here tomorrow night, so keep an eye on him.
An Aboriginal man has died in custody at a police station in central Darwin. Police confirmed that the 59-year-old was taken into custody for alcohol offences last night.
I refer to the $9.5 million cut to the Indigenous Languages Support Program.
And it also gave us the flexibility to introduce new measures. I mentioned the residents of the Australian...
Whoops, sorry.
in ballet school.
Did you catch that? So he explains. Oh, also, so so that's George Brandis, who is in fact the Attorney General, and also the Arts Minister, who is explaining in Parliament that there was a massive $1 million reduction to Indigenous languages program, which enabled fantastic new measures, such as the establishment of a residence home for the Australian Ballet School. So you kind of see how there's a disciplining of the aesthetic that's going along very heavily with the kind of expansion that the video follows there, with the intensification of extractive capital as well. So there's a third video that I like to play in terms of this sort of dramatization of where are we now, which is a little fundraising video by these guys, Carcel.
In developing countries, hundreds of thousands of women are in prison due to non-violent crimes such as drug trafficking, theft, or prostitution. I visited a maximum security prison for women. I was curious about why they were there and what they were doing inside. I discovered that the main cause of female incarceration is poverty. So we started Carcel. Carcel is a whole new type of fashion label that employs women in prison, using what we do best here in Denmark, quality, timeless design. By giving a woman in prison new skills and a good wage, she can cover basic living costs, send her children to school, save up for a crime-free beginning, and ultimately break the spiral of poverty. We've spent the past 6 months working in Peruvian prisons and getting to know the extraordinary qualities of the finest alpaca wool. Our official partnership with the National Prison System grants us a unique access to work directly with the women inside of the prison. We do not compromise on design, planet, or people. The women in prison are ready, we are ready, and the collection is ready. With your support, we can buy new knitting machines, the best quality materials, and start production.
They got to know the alpacas. So here we are. This is what we inhabit. So there's a way that the arts or the aesthetic becomes caught in the crosshairs of the current rolling crises of the liberal democratic order that the international sphere, the global, is meant to be governed by. And from here the question becomes, what can be discerned from the point of view of what I call art or formalism at or on the frontier? How might the pressures and frictions of such a moment of crisis resolve into some kind of discernible sense? And how might that help in navigating pathways towards what Beth would call an otherwise? So when thinking about the artists that Frontier Imaginaries works with, who come from, Australia, Palestine, Burma, even in Palestine from occupied Golan territories, but also from Europe, from the Netherlands, from Germany, I tried to consider what is common across their practices. And what I came from was exactly this idea of formalism at or on the frontier, which breaks down at its most basic understanding, I think, to a certain insistence for some and necessity that's unavoidable of situating the ethical sense within the sensorium of the aesthetic. So among the formal dimensions of the scopic, the sonic, the spatial, that there's some kind of ethical sense that belongs among there as well. So following that approach and reading through several of the works, I come to argue from that point of view towards something that I call the fourfold articulation as the basic governing structure of liberalism in varying arrangements and constellations that are always re-navigating each other but nonetheless ever present. The fourfold that I argue acts as an interleaved and hyperbolic matrix that legislates the proper social body of man as homo economicus and its wastes. It is the fine sieve through which the extraction of surplus today takes place as high-intensity, offshored, hedged, and public-private leveraged operations, leaching the sacrificial economies of the fourfold through the toxic sovereign construct. Articulation is an operational concept that's culled from within that cosmology, but I hope, I argue, by which it may yet be possible to untangle its parts. So, the fourfold. The formalism of arts at or on the frontier is most emphatically not reductive in the abstract. That is not to say that it is maximalist or necessarily prone to excess. Like the art historical, art concrete, this formalism is driven to seek truth through matter, although emphatically not through a universalizing vocabulary. Its concreteness lies within its positionality along enmeshed chains of value and not within a concreteness in the abstract. The posters, t-shirts and agitprop of Demian Dene Yazi, who I mentioned earlier, for example, rebel against both the macro-social erasure of First Nations Americas, as well as his own specific conditions as a young queer Dene artist in the present vortex of art professionalization. These brilliant images are clearly intended as a self-production of survivance, which is an idea advanced by First Nations critic Gerald Weisenor, and are constantly updated at the Tumblr, which is called Bury My Art at Wounded Knee, Blood and Guts in the Art School Industrial Complex. Such concrete positionality also drives the painting of Shan artist Sawangwangsi Yanghui, trained in Canada and Italy, in exile from Burma. His painting, since the passing of his father, has depicted episodes from memory, from family photographs, from books on the ongoing strife of Burmese independence, from present-day NGO publications, and from what Yanghui calls the peace industrial complex that is very much underway at present. Upon completing a particularly gestural series of paintings, Yanghui was asked why he had burdened the canvases with the names of and dates of flashpoints in Burmese and Shan minority history. Because it's my life, he responded. So although positionality draws out into the narrative world of a lifetime, it is not to be mistaken for the categorical formations of identity as such. As the fourfold articulation shows, this can never be its object and can never serve its interests. Formalism at or on the frontier rebels against interpolation into identitarian tropes, staging instead, through positional concreteness, a refusal of exchangeability. The artwork by Palestinian artist Yazan Khalili dramatizes this and cleaves as well to the uncanny alliance of arts and the law. The work was produced out of the artist's frustration that an Israeli collector had sought to purchase his work, despite the overt anti-occupation content of the work, and despite the campaign of boycott, divestment, and sanctions that had been called by Palestinian civil society, and that's very well known in the arts. In response, Khalili worked with a lawyer to draft a contract given as a deed of ownership and condition of existence that forbade the artwork to be owned or controlled by an occupying or settler colonial power or supporters thereof. With the phrase, "I, the artwork," Khalili vested the contract with corporate personhood and assigned to it the moral rights usually held by an author. And so the work is actually exhibited as this photo, which is blown up to the size such that those A4 pages are 1-to-1 and then framed. Although it doesn't exhibit the usual insignia of militancy, Khalili's the artwork is nonetheless a maximally rebellious image. The shift this indicates in Palestinian militant image making from the 1970s to now, from the AK-47 to the written contract, is instructive in grasping post-war shifts among the coordinates of market nation state as seams of global governance. What both share, however, is a refusal of exchangeability, the inability to be substitutable into a particular system or order of things. The under-examined significance of modes of exchange is the topic of Kojin Karatani, I would say his dazzling recent synthesis called The Structure of World History from Modes of Production to Modes of Exchange. Karatani's core argument is that a modes of exchange analytic offers powerful explanations of human social formations globally and, among other things, reveals the archaic and ongoing structures of plunder that always underwrite the market nation state. As Karatani explains, and I'm quoting, "The problem is, insofar as you look at material processes or economic substructures from the perspective of modes of production, you will never find the moral moment." Through a modes of exchange analytic, the Marxian value change may be turned upon its side, revealing what I've called the fourfold categories as in fact produced by the classical accounting of value. In this calculation, which I've diagrammed, value is given as that which is created where the agency of capital and labor act upon a disenchanted nature. So here, the natural also acts as a placeholder for all that is acted upon by value creation. As such, it conceals a fourfold articulation that continues on as the categories of the female, the racial, and the prior. All of these categories arise in what Marx called primitive accumulation, and counter to this title, all are in fact ongoing in the social fabric of the market nation state. A recent body of literature attests to this and has challenged the Marxian account of primitive accumulation, demonstrating the creation of the fourfold categories as crucial to the ongoing formation of market society. Silvia Federici, for example, has examined the dramatic persecution of peasant women in the Middle Ages, expunging pagan knowledges, and instituting unvalued reproductive labor, the female. Denise de Silva has examined the basis of blackness and the racial in the unaccounted for value of enslaved labor in the 19th century price of cotton. And Fred Moten, furthermore, has examined the consequence of this violent ellipsis to Marx's account of the commodity form. Distinct from the racial, I would argue, Glenshorn Coulthard has also recently critiqued the chronopolitics of quote-unquote primitive accumulation, demonstrating emphatically the present tenseness of dispossession for Indigenous communities in Canada. In addition, our dear friend Povinelli has addressed the governance of the prior as the arrangement by which settler and European societies designate themselves as within development as the time of value creation, and Indigenous societies as without a historic. At issue, so the female is kind of like a vertical cut within the society. The racial is kind of like a horizontal cut, that which is not within the genealogy of the society, and the prior is a temporal cut, all right? At issue is the fundamental operation of primitive accumulation, not as a mode of production, but as a mode of exchange in the form of plunder. As an existential architecture of belonging, owning, and obligating, the fourfold charts a cartography of dispossession that readily adapts to cybernetic innovations in the technosphere. Its technologies of dispossession remain foundational if intensified, and as such it is the fourfold that continues to shape the conditions of possibility of the arts, the law, and expressivity in general. Before moving on to the notion of articulation, which is kind of the second part of the talk, there are two short asides. The first is to note that the conjunction of market nation state is borrowed from Karatani, who expresses these as a series of interdependent Borromean rings, also borrowed from Lacan. Whereas Karatani uses the term capital, the term market is used here in order to prioritize the competing and multiple systems of capital that are differentially territorialized and socialized. Thinking of Australia, for example, the competing interests of tourism and mineral markets continually force fascinating contortions within the state and national bodies that seek to reconcile them. Secondly, formalism is here distinguished as at and on the frontier in order to prioritize the asymmetrical ways in which the matrices of the fourfold are encountered. For example, Australian artist Rachel O'Reilly utilizes the smooth space of computer-aided design and the singularity of poetic language to dramatize the non-exchangeability of ecological and social worlds into extraction-friendly business plans of state bureaucracy. In a similar mode, also from Australia, Tom Nicholson's recreated 6th century Byzantine mosaics explore a kind of chromatic exchange among small tesserae tiles as a means to piece together the horizons of Australian and Israeli settler expropriation. Both practices are dedicated to addressing the folds of the frontier, to drawing forward practices of dispossession that are often obscured from the hegemonic standpoint, and to unraveling their operations. Both artists, however, acknowledge at the outset their differential position in this work compared to that of Indigenous artists from a local or non-local area, for example. This sensitivity to how positionality capacitates practices differently is what at or on the frontier seeks to preserve. So, articulation. Within conditions of crisis, such as those currently witnessed across the NATO sphere, in tandem with its immediate adversaries, expressivity spikes. This may be witnessed as a rise in mass public gatherings, assemblies and riots, or in the extraordinary 2016 profits of Facebook, for example. The renewed critique of forms calls for a critique of expressivity as that which under law denotes the realm of artistry, and there's a legal footnote to that within jurisprudence of American law. Artistry occurs around the idea of expressivity and whose it is. And also as freedom of expression has become such a flashpoint within liberal democratic malaise. To this, the concept of articulation responds with a view from the longue durée. In the early 1500s, when the conquistadors returned from the Indies, many flocked to the convent of St. Esteban in Salamanca, Spain, to confess. In a brilliant essay on the origins of international law, legal scholar and former diplomat Marti Koskeniemi systematically traces how the crisis of faith that was provoked by colonial plunder and heard as confession was resolved by the church's formalization of an ethical offsetting between the public and the private. This divorce, naturalized as the basis of natural law, continues to underpin the international system formalized through the institutions of the Westphalian nation state. The political theological fix was led by the Prima Professor of Theology at the University of Salamanca, Francisco de Vitoria. The indisputable violence of dispossession in the Indies, without the conditions for a just war, introduced a double bind for Vitoria, caught between the testimonies of confession and the indisputable rightness of his king, Charles V. Although convinced of the innocence of the conquistadors' victims, and Vitoria expressed in a letter that the news of the colonists' acts, in quotes, freezes the blood in my veins, Vitoria simultaneously never doubted European superiority or the right of the conquistadors to encroach upon the territories of the New World. Vitoria's solution was an innovation in categorical terms, dividing human affairs into dominium jurisdictus, public law, and dominium proprietas, private ownership. The upshot, in Koskieniemi's words, was, and I'm quoting, a politico-theological vocabulary that would extend a certain idea about the justice of the private relationships on a universal basis. In short, the conquistadors were merely pursuing their justified interests in private property. This fundamental break, governing the global present as natural law, institutes a cosmos of ethical two-stepping, disconnecting certain moral chains and facilitating other value chains focused upon accessing material wealth. The fourfold articulation therefore takes place as a kind of an arts of dispossession, wrought through the production and erasure of certain joints, turning taps on and off, permitting flows there and accumulations here. In a general sense, this systemic work of producing and erasing connections can be called articulation. And thus, Yazan Khalili's I the Artwork can be grasped as a kind of a counter-practice of an arts of articulation refusing to form a certain conjunction with the ideological space of settler capital. Zooming out, Megan Cope's sculptural installation Reformation, which that's a close-up, utilizes a similar set of coordinates in diagramming territorial dispossession as it occurs in Quandamooka country in southeast Queensland, in Australia. The work mimics a midden, which is an indigenous architecture of accumulated shell and bone fragments, and it's based upon the black mineral sands and white silica sands that are separated through extraction by Belgian multinational Sibelco. The oyster shells of the black sand midden are laboriously hand-cast in concrete, which is a reference to the mass destruction of middens by 1800s convict labour that burned the shells to extract lime for brick and mortar dwellings. When exhibited in Jerusalem, and with Al-Ma'amol Foundation, the black sand, the mineral sand, was replaced by the unmistakably rusty Terra Rossa dirt of Palestine's Central Highlands, connecting up global shorelines of European colonial encroachment. This terrestrial dimension of these articulations also emerges in the recent bronze sculptures of the artist Randa Mada. Her works are produced from the experience of Majd al-Shams, which is a mountain village in the occupied Golan Heights. It's perched above the Israeli fence line to Syria and just southeast of a military base known as the Eye of the State, because from this base it's possible to see with the naked eye Damascus and down the Jordan Valley. In correspondence with Mada, shortly before his recent passing, the English critic John Berger wrote to her, and I'm quoting, "I want to describe to you how I place it, the sculpture, as a spectator in my imagination. I return to Palestine and I look at the earth I'm walking on, its grasses, its boulders, its ditches, its tangled undergrowth, its corpses, the roots of its trees, its pools, and I think that what they endure as fragments, not of the earth, but of a homeland, is expressed in the figures you create. Through you, the self-portraits of these territorial particles come into being. It's as if you hold a pebble from the Golan Heights in your left hand, and with your right, you draw what is inside it." The terrestrial dimension of this term, articulation, is perhaps necessary as well. Within a Marxian genealogy, articulation can be traced from its appearance within the late writings of Grundrisse to the schisms of 1970s Anglo-Althusserian debates and to the 1980s cultural turn of Stuart Hall. In the original German of Marx, it appears as Gliederung, derived from Glied, meaning limb, suggesting a system governed by connections, in a sense that's very similar to the Latin artis, or of articulation, meaning a joint or to fit together. So you could see, for example, Marx's schema that he gives in the Grundrisse, where he says the coexistence of limbs and their relation to the whole is governed by the order of a dominant structure, which introduces a specific order into the articulation, Gliederung, of the limbs. So a particular focus didn't appear until the 1970s, and as part of a number of system-scaled maneuvers that sought to grapple with the inadmissibly differential function of the global market system from the point of view of the third world or from development's peripheries. So as I touched upon earlier, there's a difference among practices working at or on the frontier. What appears to some as fairly smooth, what appears to some as a fairly smooth world of opening airport gates, opening bank accounts, and pleasant social interactions appears to others as a world of slamming doors. What Katabing Film Collective call their improvisational realist practice navigates the arts of articulation from this latter point of view. Their film and installation works are driven by the exhaustive labor of survivance amid the fourfold articulation. As such, obtaining funds for national and international mobility, the infrastructure of passports, the acquiring of vocabularies of arts and bureaucratic worlds are all considered an integral part of the film and installation making practice. At the far-stretched frontiers of the Australian market nation state, governance can appear surreal and even psychedelic, as in Katabing's recent film, Wutthar, Saltwater Dreaming. The film plays out across Katabing's homelands, the Belgian community, and conflicting explanations of the disastrous event of a motor breakdown. Its narrative crisscrosses the accounts of three Katabing members: Trevor, who sees a jealous world of Indigenous geontological ancestry; Jojo, who sees a disciplining world of Christian virtue; and Rex, who sees an exhausted material world of poverty, rusty wiring, and far-off sources of displacement. All are experienced as equally real, the settings of dizzying patterns of interference as they merge and subside. Ultimately, the state intervenes to put things into place. This, however, is also surreal in its own way, as a fine is levied for setting off a rescue flare without proper safety equipment. The value of the fine is 30,000 Australian dollars, levied upon Indigenous people who receive $250 a fortnight in state subsidy and with no other means of really accessing or obtaining cash money. The enormous scale, adaptability, and force of the fourfold articulation is hard to overestimate. Its centuries-long processes of world-making and world-destroying are quick to put the lie to shallow opposition and ill-worked-through revolutionary bluster. As such, the expressiveness of articulation as a counter-practice is most emphatically not the expressiveness of declarative sovereignty. It is not summoned through proclamations. Its subject is not the ideal artist in a self-realizing mode, a mode which is also heavily prioritized through corporate socialized media. So it's not the person on Facebook or Twitter making a declaration, it's something else altogether. The emergent emancipatory sovereignties of formalism at or on the frontier are, perhaps, no sovereignty at all. It may just be artists, in the guise of people, navigating the tender footholds of the present and grasping for some stronger base upon which to stand, not in the sense of self-determination and abstract freedoms, but as the world that emerges in the social and terrestrial capacity to form one's own dependencies. The end. Yeah. How long did I talk for?
I don't know, but I have no idea what we're going to do.
I'm just going to have a quick sip.
Okay.
That's right. For questions from the audience first. Yeah, that's cool. Are there any questions or responses from the audience first?
Do you find the identifying of some of these people as artists problematic?
Like who?
Anyone.
Well, Okay, so first of all, this is an argument that I came across in the De Apple curatorial program. When I arrived there from Brisbane to Amsterdam, and within this quite intensive environment, there were 6 of us, and we had some really big arguments within the group exactly around this question of like what's proper. Like, can certain things properly be exhibited in the space of art? And within the Queensland Art Gallery, which is where I grew up in Brisbane, there's the art history wing, right? And it begins with sort of lots of oil paints, lots of landscapes, and then it kind of goes through Impressionism, and then it kind of gets into other forms of modernism, Australian modernism, and then it gets to the 60s, and then there's this amazing room that has this crazy guy from Scotland who ended up on an island off the coast of Australia painting nutty abstract stuff with sand in it that's beautiful. Sidney Nolan, who painted a set of allegories of a woman who was stranded on an island. And then there's these 3 barks that are called the Yalangbara barks, and they're actually kind of drafts of a petition that was given to the Australian government at the very, very beginning of the land rights era. So those, yeah, it's a law document, but it's a set of images. And I'm all for just getting into the conversation. So there's a certain way, like curatorial work is the work of deciding do things go together or not. So it's an inherently feminized kind of work. It's inherently invested in like what is proper. And what is proper is exactly what organizes the fourfold. And so I say, be improper, you know? It's also exactly, like I was literally told by a funding body that it wasn't relevant for Indigenous artists to go to Palestine, you know? That was somehow an improper connection. So I'm all for it. Beth, your turn.
Yeah. The question of the proper and the improper is one question. Then the question, do you find it right to call all of or some of these folks artists? And it's an interesting question, and it's a question that, you know, that at least, you know, I'm the only one here tonight, so, but there'll be about 7 or 8 of us in October. It's an interesting question because, as you know, because the self-identity of people in the collective, including me, as what are you, artist, is not like, no, right? That, you know, I think at this point we're very comfortable saying we make films, and we're also comfortable saying we also now we make, because we did an installation at Contour, that we, how do we would put it, we like pull out some stuff, right? But I wouldn't say that the self-nomination of artists, or even the self-nomination of filmmakers, maybe a little more filmmakers, okay. But what's really interesting about the curatorial practices of, say, Frontier Imaginaries or other, but Frontier Imaginaries, yeah, Natasha's work and stuff, is that that's not something that one has to self-nominate as. And instead, as we move around in different, because there's about 30, if we're talking about the Cotabine, there's about 30 of us. As we move around, it's not about art, it really is about what are people making of themselves that we can understand in these kind of spaces. And whether it's art or not art, I mean, it's just not the question, which is really, so I take your question as a really interesting one. It's like, it's not even about we're being improper artists or improper filmmakers. That's not that's not the question or the conversation, nor is it what we get out of this, which is, if it was that, then it would be like, oh, I don't know. I mean, maybe not. But we're not asked that.
But the thing is that I'm asked that all the time because I write funding applications all the time. And so I'm constantly going like, this is radical and innovative and don't worry about what it is because I'm a good curator and I'm here to tell you it's good, you know? So I'm kind of like doing that covering all the time and arguing with funding bodies about why hip hop people should be in their mandate or not, you know, and it's a real battle a lot of the time. And that's why Frontier Imaginaries is kind of actually a strategic intervention as well. So Frontier Imaginaries, as you will have gathered, kind of emerges from the settler colony and takes seriously a kind of an idea of a settler region. So that would be that there is like a very functioning region, but it's territorially disarticulated. And so that's Australia, New Zealand, Canada, States is a weird one, but sure. Israel, South Africa, the big ones. There's many more smaller ones. And so the point is that plenty of these governments, as well as the mining corporations, are kind of comparing notes and like, oh, you encountered that blockage, you know, how did you get around it in terms of what a little local response was, you know. But the folks who have got the grounded social projects don't have such great access to each other. And to a certain extent, Frontier Imaginaries mobilize the inherent, tries to activate the inherent mobility of art, contemporary art, in order to facilitate connections within that region as well.
Next project. Just like to know if there has been any, or which country are you addressing right now to, if there has been already any reply or answer from artists or any other community from this country?
I mean, the way that you put that was really beautiful because so far Frontier Imaginaries has had the luck to work only on the basis of invitation. I don't think there's any way that I would have kind of like said like, oh, Palestine's really relevant, I'm gonna go there. Do you know what I mean? Like it's always been based on invitation, which has been a serious blessing. And so Beth basically has made an invitation to come to New York. I mean, Beth initiated that and then got these e-flux people in on the game. So, so we're coming here in October, and so I'm here learning a bit about what's going on here and what's active here and sort of what the state of the conversation is. There's also a big part of the project coming up in the Netherlands, which is funny because, as I said, like the whole idea of a frontier is quite hard for folks within the Netherlands to understand, and yet the artist Rachel O'Reilly, whose diagrams I showed, is talking about the rollout of the fracking industry throughout Queensland. And one of the major flashpoints of that was the dredging of Gladstone Harbour, which kind of cut a chunk of the Great Barrier Reef out in order to build the world's biggest coal port that could allow gas and coal extracted to move north. And the sea vessel that did that dredging was called the Rotterdam, because the Netherlands remains dominant in the global industry of dredging and land water. So my argument is that is part of Dutch territorial space, you know, and the Dutch territorial space hasn't really been this little area since 400 or 500 years, you know. So if we're talking about what the space of the Dutch nation is, what is that really, and what does it mean to allow or disallow access to it?
Maybe one of the things we might talk about is how you think about the regionalization of the frontier, because one of the lies of that was told at the beginning of this session was that you know, Vivian learns from what Beth writes in e-flux. That's a lie, because one of the good things about this form of curating is that if its point is to put in place a conversation rather than stage a show, I mean, if the heart of it is that. And to put it in conversation, a particular spacing, rather than hang in a space, art from a place or a person or a set of people, like a group show. Then the question around the curating of the frontier or frontiers becomes, you know, what do we think a frontier is? And what, for someone like me, not in my art, you know, filmmaking, but as, you know, Elizabeth A. Povinelli, I suppose, what do we think of, what tools do we have for thinking what is a frontier? Like, and the posing of that question to me, here speaking individually, has been really productive because, you know, on the one hand, we have the models of sovereignty, both sovereignty as expressed in settler colonialism. So you have that two opposing forces, and at the line of resistance, the frontier, right? And then, you know, and we long ago don't think through sovereignty as these two opposing forces, although, you know, we might want to, and we might come to another example of Schmidt and these uncanny convergences. But another one is like, you know, we know it doesn't work like that. It's rhizomic, and like, how do we think of frontier when we're thinking about a rhizome unfolding itself? But that's not what I think is rich and interesting here. And it was through trying to think, okay, well, and think with, you know, with my colleagues in Australia, we're like, what do we think a frontier is? Do we think it's defined by Europe coming and demographically sitting on top and annihilating or trying to annihilate, or process of genocide like Patrick Wolf, or, you know, is it that? Or, so we can say where it happened and where it didn't happen, right? Or is it, do we think of frontier as something really different? And this is where I started thinking about a frontier as that space where an embankment becomes a set of strainings and of tailings, right? So how do we then rethink of what are artists in this, right? And at least for, like, if, you know, if Jojo was here or if Gavin was here, because, you know, we've been in places like this before, so I'm sorry, guys, I'm paraphrasing you, but when they say, you know, people say, well, why do you make film? You know, why do you make film? Why do you do this? And the different people describe it in different ways. One way of just, you know, when Jojo describes it, she's like, to show that we're still going, which is we're able to continue to embank and hold ourselves in the world, which, you know, survivance might be a word. And in all these ways of putting it, it's like, how do we think about the frontier as the experience of the disembankment, the sucking out of resources, the putting a strain on whatever it is that holds us in place, and being that space in which that straining is happening, and that the struggle is to literally remain in place, which, you know, you could say remain in place is a bad thing. How was that art? But remaining in place is an art in the frontier, right? The most creative, the most innovative, you know, any kind of word, the most artistic, the most aesthetically, rhetorically powerful, the most, whatever it is being able to stay in place in a system that is constantly trying to open tailings, and I don't know if that's, I don't know what that is, but if art can be used, filmmaking can be used to be a modality in which you can keep that embankment in place, that's cool. But the frontier is that space of who will disembank and withdraw resources, and who has the power to embank. And I think that, rather than this place or that place or the other place or this seam or the other seam, is, at least in our reading, what what a frontier is. So, you know, certain people's skins, like in Flint, you know, a neighborhood is a frontier if the toxic load has to be borne by a neighborhood defined by poverty and race. That's the frontier. And how do you, yeah.
In the first edition of Frontier Imaginaries in Brisbane, it was two shows. And one show was called The Life of Lines at the QT Art Museum. The other show was called No Longer at Ease. And the show Life of Lines was very much about like the frontier as this like horizon. And so that's where we had material from the Shell film unit, and it was kind of showing the way that Shell had shifted from the 1950s of depicting itself in kind of like biopolitics and like men installing huge tunnels into the ground as the building of a nation, and by the 1970s was showing itself as some kind of like superhuman globe-spanning corporation that had some kind of power that went beyond anything that was like biological or individual. And so that was like the Life of Lines, but then No Longer at Ease was very much about an intimate realm of the frontier as well, and sort of that's where Demian's work was, and that was where, for example, Alice Kriescher had a beautiful work as a German artist that was kind of trying to understand that as a German woman artist who was long-term involved in kind of like lefty Marxist projects. Was making this work at the time of the Greek crisis and trying to understand the total failure of those ideals, and was doing so with her kids as part of this beautiful kind of video tableau of people on a beach, which is actually within a former World War II Zeppelin manufacturer, and it's now a fake beach holiday resort. And we had been in dialogue about this particular history, which is that a number of the communards were executed, but those who weren't executed were deported to New Caledonia. And so she kind of looked at that as this weird horizon of the failure of certain Marxist ideals as well, within her family project also. Any other questions?
Me? Okay, I'm not sure why we're talking about it, but okay, okay, so sorry. No, I'm totally happy to. No, I'm totally happy to. But it's also, I mean, I don't know why. Anyways, it's really interesting. So, it's totally your fault. So I wrote a book. I wrote a book, and you read it, and you totally read it. Okay, so I wrote a book, and in the book, so I'll back up. One of the questions that for me has been important, and again, this is as me, the academic person, has been important since what my work tries, in a very simple way, what my work with my colleagues tries to do is like, what does late settler liberalism look like from where you're living? And I do say late settler liberalism rather than late settler colonialism, not because I don't think it's settler colonialism, but because I don't want to let liberalism off the hook. So it's as if you say colonialism, then people can say, well, see, not talking about liberalism. It's like, no, it's late settler liberalism. At least for me, that's important, which is not in opposition to calling it settler colonialism. It's just a different insistence. So that always raised a question, how do we conceptualize liberalism as a form and a thing, which is in parallel to conversations that have been happening for a very long time with along the lines of how do we conceptualize capital as a form and a thing? Do we? In particular with capital, since you would probably know this since it was a big discussion happening in the 90s, do we give too much power to capitalism when we we just act as if it's just what's since whatever it was, 1878, yeah, like that. So that it's like capitalism, 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 no matter what has happened in history, no matter where you go, no matter anything, it's still capitalism. And it's like, fuck that shit. So, because we've abstracted out and say capitalism is this form, right? And nothing you can do has deformed that so that we can say we're not living in capitalism. So there's a lot of debate that was happening, like Depeche was thinking about it, Gibson Graham, a lot of people would think about it. Similarly, with liberalism, usually in political theory, folks say liberalism is X, and then they measure whether or not this or that instance meets whatever definition you did. So that's not the way I think about things. Instead, how do we think imminently about modes of governance that, because they're moving and being moved, and you look, how did you oppress your people? That's a good strategy. We'll try it here. But when you move it over here, you insert it into a particular kind of moment and terrain and et cetera. And so it morphs a little bit. It cannot be exactly the same thing. There's no identity across forms. But there's also no relationship. So that's something that I've been thinking about a lot. And when I think about late settler liberalism, what is it from here? It's also to disperse it, to say you're not one, you're not identical, you're not a singular power that just works everywhere. So in economies of abandonment, in order to suggest that might be a way we think liberalism, that is, it's not some power that is like abstract, but rather a set of techniques of governance that is always trying to adjust in order to keep value flowing basically in a certain direction and keep value being accumulated by the same old, right? So how do we map that? And so the symphony, this is not the original symphony. The original symphony was a lower stanza and an upper stanza. And the lower stanza was, if you're standing with my friends and colleagues in North Australia, this is the sound of a certain kind of liberal history that creates an upper stanza, right? So it's not the upper stanza is the global history and here's the local. It's like from here, you create the sounds of the global. And my idea was always, and I always say, this is what it is from here. What is it from there? So if you put in another stanza, it wouldn't just add another stanza, it would change the top stanza too. So that by saying all we can do is keep on putting these stanzas in, maybe we'll start seeing not an abstract definition of what liberalism is, but liberalism's all its variations of thematics, right? All that sound, thus the twistings and distortions that can happen. Okay, so that was the idea. And then Vivian, so I'm just cruising along, and I'm just cruising along. But anyway, so Vivian, Natasha Ginroller and Vivian had invited me to something, and then Vivian was doing Frontier Imaginaries, and she said, I want to put your symphony in the show. And I was like, oh, okay. She said, but I need a really big PDF. And I said, why do you need a PDF? And she said, I'm going to put it on the wall. I said, that's stupid. Don't put it on the wall. Why do you want to put it on the wall? And she said, it was art. I said, no, it's not art. I said, no, what am I saying? That's fine, put it on the wall. But if you're really going to make it that big, what I want is what I couldn't do in a book, because, you write a book, and then you put it in the book, and you never see how people mark up the book. And, I want to see how people mark up the book. I want to see what no, that's not. So I said, you have to stick 2 pens on the wall with the symphony. And we have to some way get people to say, it's not a piece of art like that. it's not a piece of art. It's whatever, I don't know what art is. Art now is whatever it is, but I don't care. But whatever it is, whether that's art now or not art now or whatever art is, I don't care. I want people to go, not that I'm making more art, but I'm intervening in this symphony. And it took a moment. I think I got you to do it first, but by the end it was amazing. It was like not my symphony anymore. It was just a totally other, and it wasn't one other, it was just bunches of them being, and then when you looked at it, you learned all sorts of histories and connections, both lower, upper, middle, that, you know, so that's what the frontier is for me.
It was beautiful because it was also like the toilet door of late liberalism. Do you know what I mean? Like, this is like, I was here by all these kids, and it's beautiful.
Like, my name is Sammy. I was like, yes, Sammy.
You know, but so you had this sense of like a counter chorus as well, which is just beautiful. You know, it's sort of like.
So when Vivian was doing the Jerusalem version of Frontiers, well, you can say.
Yeah. Well, so Frontier Imaginaries kind of like has this way of like clicking and dragging itself around. And so when we went to Palestine on the invitation of Al Maamel, then it was important to sort of like bring the symphony across, but to, exactly as Beth said, to alter it. And so we worked with, there was an amazing political economist called Raja Khalidi, who's in Jerusalem and runs the Khalidi Waqf, which is this beautiful, very significant body of manuscripts as well, and who's also a political economist. Because the question is, like, what are the reciprocal events? And one of the things that was really interesting in working with him on this is that from the Australian perspective, I kind of got the picture, but from the Palestinian perspective, there was this whole question of the nation, which absolutely doesn't map onto the way that the indigenous struggle is played out. And that took a lot of understanding, and it was really through going through this process that it was sort of like possible to do some of that mapping as well. And you'll see that so Beth's original one begins at 1950, obviously with Palestine we had to kind of take it back to 48, right? Like,
we read it in different, so
yeah.
We read it, what is this?
Yeah. Yeah, so this is in Arabic, so it goes right to left, and then exactly as Beth has said, like there was a whole lot of UN stuff that had to go in the top stanza that wasn't there from the indigenous point of view. It's like that stuff was just totally irrelevant, but from the Palestinian point of view, there was a whole lot of new things that went up there and also like, because Beth kind of periodizes this stuff, like white man's burden to civilizational securitization, which is the one since S11. And, but then from the Palestinian perspective, the big periodization was like freedom fighter and humanitarian aid to terrorist and development. I mean, like that's how you periodize liberalism.
And you know, the big point, I suppose, for me, just speaking as me, is what do we think concepts? What do we think concepts should be doing? And here, you know, I'm still like, what is it, rule of thumb kind of delusion, I suppose, where the concept is supposed to make something visible. It's not supposed to aspire to be the new universal. It's supposed to open up a visibility of space that says, if this helps you, use it, distort it from wherever you're standing. If it does not, do not cram it in there, right? So how do we use concepts, whether they're drawings or writings or words or pieces of whatever, images that go, you know, cinema, how do we use them as a concept in that sense? And how do we open them and say, tear it up? It's not here to discipline, but to perhaps make something visible that otherwise wouldn't be visible. And that's what, if the frontier is anything, the frontier's got to be that. Yeah.
So it's like a navigational tool within Frontier Imaginaries. Yeah, it's an artwork info, whatever you want to call it. It's a map or a device or something. But it also points to something really, really important, which is also really, really helpful, which is that, because the first question I have with the symphony always is like, oh, but what does it sound like? And we're going to get there. For sure, this thing's going to be scored one day and that's going to be a whole process. But my first response is always like, no, the point is not for you to hear it. The point is for you to imagine history without events, right? Is for you to imagine history as a kind of a texture of sound that's like weirdly warping and dissonant and without logos, right? Like it's like the expressivity of historical events understood otherwise.
But is it still linear?
Well, yeah, totally. You know, honestly, yeah. Like, I'm so not going to try and get out of that one. You know, I don't know. It's so weird. Yeah, it's also, but it's like, yeah, I can't defend that. Yeah, totally.
But that's the dissonant part of it anyway. We can get into that. But the major stanza.
But, you know, I was talking I have a friend who I'm going to get to at least make this sound like something for me. But, you know, it's like, can we have like music without time? And he's like, oh, Beth, come on. I said, well, but, because, yeah, you're right. I mean, of all the people, I don't believe in that, right? I believe in like that. But yeah.
And if you're charting liberalism.
What?
If you're charting liberalism.
Yeah, but I know, but I get the point. I mean, I know, and to be honest, it was also just I was saying, you know, that Deleuze thing where he does this shit yeah, that's also I was just going like citing that, to be honest. So yeah.
I think what is that thing where he does
Can we
shit?
just be honest? Oh yeah, it's that where is it? That thing where he does? Yeah, it's 1,000 Plateaus. Yeah, and I was like. Okay, Mr. Deleuze. Which is honestly
fun in
part
theory
of,
with Beth Pavanelli.
Yeah. I mean, it's got to have a little bit of fun in theory. I mean, really seriously. I mean, it's very serious, but also like, what errant might have, like, listen, what errant might happen if we just like flow with that. But don't take it super seriously. I really fear. I think of it as a Gregorian chant, but I would never. I hope never to hear it. Although I did lie with Kaledi. He's like, do you hear this? I don't hear it. I was like, oh yeah, I hear it.
Oh yeah, in my mind.
I totally, in my mind, it's all sound.
It was so funny because this guy, Rasha Khalidi, he's like this super pragmatic Palestinian political economist, and he's like, what is this? I don't get it. Why, are we supposed to hear this? Does it work? What is it?
Yeah, like, can't you hear it? It's like, yeah. Anyway. If there's anything like oh.
Drink more.
Yeah, I can talk about it. Yeah, maybe in the Middle Eastern context, like get a musician to make a makam out of it instead of a symphony, have like a really long opening and like 8 instead of 4.
Yeah, that would be
good. We can work something out.
Yeah.
But though,
you're hired.
No, but what I wanted to ask actually is when you talked about the different forms that late settler liberalism takes and like this is what it looks like from here, what does it look like from there, I was sort of also thinking about how to project this notion onto the frontier. Because we're talking about very different geographies here also. So when things move places, they don't only move history, they also move geography and like the intersection of the two. So I was thinking about the difference between the map you showed of Australia and, for example, Israel-Palestine, that's built much more around the notion of verge or friction or a very overlapping proximity and things being constantly sort of crammed and under closure, and the political notion of a closure as well, and that's just an entirely different physical geography. And I'm wondering, in your experience, what happens to the idea of the frontier when we move geographies like that?
Yeah, it's really productive in my experience. I mean, like, even you can begin at the conceptual level. I mean, one of the things was that with the Columbia International, they were working on this idea of return. I'd never, I'm, I guess, a bit naive. I really hadn't come across this concept before. And it took me a number of goes to even begin to get it, because when you pull the idea of the return into the Australian context, it kind of radicalizes everything. Like all this native title, all this treaty, it's like, oh, they want to return? Like, that's really big concept. And it's interesting the way that the Palestinian project uses apartheid to try to mobilize its claims. But you're right. I mean, one of the first things that I encountered going to Palestine was the scale at which it was happening. So radically different to the Australian scale. I don't know. This is my how do you say, the methodology of frontier imaginaries is exactly this kind of like transverse or improper connections, and that being a productive way where it's kind of this thing. Actually, I went on about it all the time when I was there about same but different, and the productive value of same but different, and of being able to work with that as opposed to being like we're different and we have to be people from Gaza and people from the West Bank and people who are in the exile who actually can't see eye to eye, but being like, oh no, we've got this weird thing where we can kind of like be together but be different, and then our South African colleagues can be with us and our Burmese colleagues, and we can kind of get, like, we can get a better chart out of that as opposed to chafe against each other.
And maybe I'm not hearing, but the wall is the frontier, but the wall is exactly why, you know, you can think of the wall as a surface, and there, you know, the surfaces, but the wall is like, you know, it's like, can you pick at the wall? Can you climb the wall? You paint the wall's falling down. How do you keep the wall up? How do you get things through the wall without getting other things through the wall?
The wall's only there in the cities anyway. It's a bloody performance.
Yeah,
like
no,
the moment you're at the cities,
but
it's
that's
just defense.
that's if we think about frontiers as those spaces of embankment in which power is always operating to pull it apart or keep it in place. I mean, it's kind of, obviously it's neutral in the sense of keeping it in place, maybe, like with Karabing, keeping themselves as a kind of wall-ish thing by using filmmaking, you know, whatever it is, using it and thickening themselves, I would say that's great. Making a huge fence and cramming people into the West Bank is not a good thing. So it's not that the wall is good or the wall is bad, but it's the frontier where that the expression of power and extraction of affectus is most visible and most played out. And so what would happen if we thought about politics as that straining, embankment, tailing space? Yeah.
Also the Mediterranean Sea.
The Mediterranean Sea, yeah, exactly.
Between the wall and the Mediterranean Sea.
Yeah, exactly. No, exactly. So for me, it was really productive to start thinking, you know, the rhizome doesn't really, you know, like a lot of people that, you know, but it doesn't really work to give me, because it's like, it's so, and, you know, it's a great thing. It's like the rhizome, it's
without friction. That's the thing. The frontier is friction, whereas the rhizome just...
The rhizome moves, and I thought, you know, again, the rhizome, it's like settler colonialism's rhizome. And I'm not saying that thus Deleuze is bad. No, it's just like, okay, well, I see the work it was doing where he was trying to do work. But if you're trying to do work here, how do we rethink this, you know, the frontier, which used to be like this antagonistic sovereign thing, and then it was like, there's not a frontier, there's this rhizomatic unfolding, and it's like, okay, but no, that doesn't work where, you know, where my life is and my friends' lives are. Yeah.
And that's...
Especially because the rhizome was used by the IDF as a philosophical foundation for a war tactic.
Yeah. No, again, I tend to think that these forms are political, in here I mean politically neutral. Insofar as, like, you know, a rhizome could be a strategy of like resisting a kind of sovereign kind of thing. But the idea that it's just a positivity and anti-resistance, it's also really wrong on the other side. Yeah. Yeah. Anyways, or that's what I think. And it's so great to be at e-flux.
So good then. Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Amal.
Thanks, Brian. Thanks, Amal. Thanks, everybody.
Friends running the sound.
Right on. Thanks for you guys for coming.
Trevor.
And you know, it's going to be really terrific. And I will say,
October.
October is going to be great. And honestly, the only reason Cotter Bing makes films is people wanted to come to New York, and we thought,
Right. Totally.
maybe that's the way we can get here.
Trevor wanted to be a movie star.
Trevor wanted to be a movie star, yeah.
And then everyone else wanted to come to New York.
And everyone else wanted to come to New York. So in October, come meet people who are not me. Thank you, Vivian. That was amazing.